The world had already burned. Cities crumbled, families torn apart, and the dead reclaimed the earth. A man like Glenn Rhee had always fought to keep hold of his humanity in the face of all that horror. But when Maggie died, something in him broke, snapped, and whatever innocence he had left was buried alongside her in the dirt. It had happened at the outpost, a simple raid or so they thought. They had stormed a savior compound, blades and bullets carving through the unsuspecting soldiers, but the enemy fought harder than expected. Glenn never saw the man coming, that towering brute swinging a rusted pipe at Maggie's temple before he could reach her. He had screamed her name too late. Her body crumpled to the ground, blood pooling in her dark hair. Glenn hadn't thought. He had lunged, tackling the monster that stole her life, and bashed his face into the pavement until nothing was left but pulp. They had won the fight, but Glenn had lost more than a battle that day. As the others pulled him off the corpse, his breaths ragged and his hands slick with blood, he wasn't the same man anymore. At first, Rick and the others tried to comfort him. They told him they understood. They told him time would make it easier. But nothing eased the agony gnawing at his chest. Nothing filled the void that Maggie left behind. And before long, Glenn stopped seeking their reassurances. It started with the way he spoke in the war room. Plans became tactical, cold. He was methodical, efficient. Ruthlessness crept into his voice. They needed to hit the saviors even harder, he said. Needed to gut them from the inside. The enemy couldn't be allowed to rise again. When they captured a savior scout outside Alexandria, Rick suggested mercy, a prisoner exchange, even. Glenn didn't ask for permission. That night, he had dragged the man away and slit his throat, leaving his body for the walkers to pick clean. Carol was the first to say something. "This isn't who you are, Glenn." He laughed at that, a dry, bitter thing. "I am what the world made me." Daryl stopped looking him in the eye after that. Michonne watched him like he was a storm waiting to break. Even Rick, who knew better than anyone what loss could do to a man, began to question whether Glenn could still be trusted. But the worst part? Glenn didn't care. The next time they encountered a group of saviors, there were no whispered plans about ambushes, no cautious discussions on avoiding casualties. Glenn led the charge himself. They were outnumbered, but Glenn fought without fear, tearing through their enemies with a fury that terrified even his own people. In the end, no saviors were left breathing. That night, when they returned to Alexandria, covered in blood, Glenn stood before the community and said, "No more negotiating, no more mercy. We finished this." People whispered in the streets. This wasn't the same Glenn who had laughed with Maggie in the watchtower, who had named his unborn child under a starlit sky. This was someone else, someone who had no patience for the foolishness of hope. Raids became slaughters. Warnings became final deaths. With each step, every decision, Glenn carved a legend out of his grief. When the saviors warned Negan about him, spoke of the man who wouldn't stop, who wouldn't falter, the warlord himself grew wary. Negan had long believed there was no one in Rick's little tribe colder than himself. He was wrong. And so, the world would remember Glenn Rhee not as the man who once believed in rebuilding, but as the one who ensured no one who crossed his people would ever walk away again. Glenn was no longer a man who hoped for better days. He was a man who made sure his enemies never saw another sunrise. The night after his declaration in Alexandria, the air was thick with unease. The people who had once trusted him, who had looked at him as Maggie's husband, as the optimist among them, now watched him with quiet fear. Glenn saw it in the way Aaron hesitated before speaking, in the way Rosita reached for her gun whenever he walked past. They didn't say it, but they were wondering if Glenn Rhee had become something worse than their enemies. Rick called a meeting in the church, but Glenn already knew what it was about. Michonne was the first to step forward, her voice low, measured. "You're pushing too hard. We've won more battles than we've lost. We can end this without becoming them." Glenn leaned against the nearest pew, arms crossed. "You're wrong. Negan doesn't believe in peace, he believes in control. If we leave even a scrap of the saviors alive, they will rebuild, and next time it'll be bloodier." His voice was icy, absent of doubt. We finish them now, or we spend the rest of our lives running. Rick rested his hands on the table, meeting Glenn's stare. There was something unsettled in his eyes, something like recognition. I've been where you are. No, you haven't, Glenn interrupted, his voice sharp as a blade. I watched Maggie die screaming while I was powerless to stop it. I buried my wife knowing we brought a child into this hell, and that now, there's no one left to remember them but me. His jaw clenched, his expression unreadable. I won't let her death be for nothing. I can't. Daryl exhaled sharply from the corner of the room. You ain't the only one who's lost something, man. We all have. Then act like it, Glenn shot back. Stop pretending like there's a choice here. For a long moment, the only sound was the creak of the old wooden floor beneath their shifting weight. Glenn could see the hesitation flicker across their faces. The doubt, still too soft, too willing to hope. Carol wasn't. She straightened, arms crossed over her chest, studying him the way one might a feral dog. You're right about one thing, she said, voice low. This isn't over until it's over. Question is, how far are you willing to go? Glenn met her stare, unflinching. Whatever it takes. The decision came in the dead of night. There would be no half measures, no drawn-out war. Glenn devised a plan, not for a siege, not for a battle, but for extermination. They would strike the sanctuary itself, but not in the way Negan expected. 2 nights later, under a moonless sky, Glenn led a small team inside. Daryl, Carol, Rosita, and a few others followed, though unease clung to them like smoke. They moved through the compound like ghosts, silent and merciless. The bunker's ventilation system, rigged with gasoline. The water supply, poisoned with walker blood. By the time the fires were set, the alarms were nothing more than an eerie backdrop to the screams. Glenn stood in the courtyard as chaos erupted, watching the flames lick the night sky. His face was unreadable. Smoke curled against his skin, the acrid stench of death filling his nostrils, but he didn't flinch. Saviors spilled into the open, coughing, stumbling, and his people cut them down without a word. There was no honor in this, no sportsmanship, only survival. Then Negan emerged, the man who had once loomed over all of them like a force of nature. The menace, the myth, standing in the firelight, eyes burning with rage. Glenn caught sight of Lucille in his hands, the same bat that had been meant to kill him once upon a time. Now it trembled at his side. Well, shit, Negan exhaled, shaking his head. Didn't see this coming. Glenn stepped forward, unhurried, calm. That's your problem, he said evenly. You don't see people. You see property. You thought you could take everything from us and we'd just break. Negan laughed, but there was something hollow in it. Gotta say, kid, you turned out meaner than I gave you credit for. Glenn tilted his head. And you turned out weaker than I thought. The words struck something in Negan. Glenn saw it in the way his grip on Lucille faltered, just a fraction. The 2 men stood amidst the wreckage, the dead and dying around them, and for the first time in Negan's reign, the sanctuary burned. This, Negan growled, gesturing to the hellscape before him. This ain't mercy. This is slaughter. Glenn's expression remained blank. It's justice. Negan stepped forward, rolling his shoulders, the firelight casting jagged shadows across his face. Let's settle this, he said, voice low, dangerous. Glenn met his gaze and, for the first time in his life, felt no fear. No, he wasn't the same man who had once scavenged for supplies in a rundown Atlanta. He wasn't the hopeful husband, the bright-eyed survivor lucky enough to find love in the apocalypse. That man had died beside Maggie. This man would make sure no one ever lost what he did again. Negan's smirk tightened into something else entirely, something that wasn't quite anger, not quite fear, wariness. He ran his tongue over his teeth, glancing at the carnage around him. His kingdom in ruins, his saviors torn apart or dying slow, agonizing deaths. His boots crunched over broken glass as he took another step toward Glenn, posture loose, but ready, always ready. Glenn didn't move, wasn't fazed by Negan's theatrics. The way his presence alone used to command a crowd, strike terror in anyone standing in his path. Those days were over. Maggie's blood had hardened in his veins, had carved away at the last of his restraint. He wasn't afraid of anything anymore. "You want to do this the old-fashioned way? Fine," Negan muttered, flexing his fingers around Lucille's handle, his grin twisting into something grim, ugly. "But you gotta know, kid, I take my time with this kind of thing. And you made this real goddamn personal." Glenn inhaled deeply, slow, let the moment stretch between them. "Yeah," he muttered, gaze darkening. "I did." Then he moved. He never gave Negan the chance to swing first. The moment the warlord tightened his grip, prepared to strike, Glenn surged forward, ducking low. He felt the wind shift as Lucille came down hard with a whooshing crack, but he was already out of its path, already driving his shoulder into Negan's ribcage. They hit the ground hard. Negan grunted as Glenn's full weight crashed over him, Lucille sliding from his grasp. But it wasn't enough. Negan was strong, dangerous even without the weapon in his hands. The bastard threw a wild elbow, catching Glenn across the jaw, forcing him back just enough for Negan to scramble to his feet. The warlord staggered, wiping blood from his mouth, expression twisting into something darker. "Damn," he mused, cracking his neck. "Didn't think you had it in ya, Ree." Glenn didn't answer, didn't waste time trading words. He lunged, catching Negan off guard, slamming his fist into the man's face. Then again, and again. He felt the sharp resistance of bone and cartilage falling apart beneath his knuckles. Negan snarled, ripping Glenn off him with a burst of raw strength. He spat blood into the dirt, nostrils flaring. "You're something else, you know that?" he growled. "Almost makes me wish I picked you over Red." At the mention of Abraham, fury ignited like a wildfire inside Glenn. He swung again, but Negan blocked it this time, stepping into the attack rather than recoiling. He grabbed Glenn by the collar, yanking him forward. "Tell me something," Negan rasped, almost conversational. "You slaughtered my people, burned my goddamn home to the ground. But do you really think this'll fix you?" Glenn drove his knee up into Negan's gut, wrenching free. He let the man stumble back, coughing for breath. "No," Glenn admitted, voice eerily calm. "I don't." Then he grabbed Lucille. The bat was heavier than he expected. Her wood splintered, stained with years of violence. He turned her over in his grip, staring at her, at the weapon that had shattered his world. Before tightening his grasp and stepping forward, Negan laughed under his breath, shaking his head. "You really think that makes you any different than me?" Glenn stared at him, silent for one long, agonizing moment. Then he swung. The first hit knocked Negan to the ground, a sickening crunch splintering through the air. The second one made sure he stayed there. With each downward arc, Glenn felt something in himself ebb away, some last tether to who he used to be snapping under the force of his grief, his rage. By the time the bat slipped from his fingers, Negan's body lay still in the blood-soaked dirt. The fire crackled around them, the only sound breaking the silence. Glenn stood over the ruin of him, chest rising and falling, his breath steady. He felt nothing, not relief, not triumph, just the ever-present emptiness that had swallowed him whole. The others, his people, Daryl, Carol, Rosita, stood nearby, watching. None of them spoke. After a long silence, Carol stepped forward, voice hardly above a whisper. "It's over." Glenn exhaled through his nose, slow, steady. He turned, glanced at them, watched the flickering firelight dance across their faces. "No," he said finally, voice devoid of anything. "It's just different now." There was no celebration that night, no victory speeches, no reassurances that peace had finally come. Instead, they watched the fire consume what remained of the sanctuary, listened to the distant moans of the dead that would inherit what was left of it. When it was all said and done, Glenn didn't look back. He had nothing left to bury, nothing left to grieve, only the road and the ghosts that would follow him wherever he went. Ezekiel watched Glenn from a distance, the faint glow of dawn illuminating both men's faces. The king had seen more than his share of tragedy, yet the change in Glenn disturbed him on a level he couldn't articulate. He moved closer with careful steps, the crunch of gravel underfoot betraying his approach. Glenn turned, his eyes shadowed, as though waiting for someone else to haunt him. In the pale morning light, ruins of the sanctuary still smoldered. Smoke curled toward the sky, carrying the acrid scent of scorched metal and burned flesh. Ezekiel pressed his lips together. "These people followed you," he said softly, gesturing to where Daryl and Carol stood among the rubble. "They believed your fight was just." Glenn's gaze flickered over the remnants of the once imposing structure. "They got what we promised them," he said after a moment, voice a monotone. "The saviors are gone." Ezekiel inclined his head, letting silence settle between them. His royal theatrics had mellowed over time, worn down by the relentless grind of survival. Yet he still carried an air of quiet dignity, even now. "Perhaps the saviors are gone," Ezekiel replied slowly. "But victory should not taste like ash." Glenn exhaled, eyes on the horizon. "Some things don't need to taste good to be necessary." They stood side by side, saying nothing else for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Ezekiel placed a hand on Glenn's shoulder, a gentle weight. Glenn didn't shrug it off, but he didn't lean into it either. A muffled groan sounded from behind a heap of broken concrete. Glenn turned abruptly, hand flying to the knife on his belt. The tension in his posture spoke volumes. He was ready to kill again without hesitation. But Ezekiel held out an arm, stopping him. A lone savior, charred cloth clinging to his burned skin, crawled across the rubble. He reached out with blistered fingers, eyes rolling in desperation. Glenn's jaw tightened. "He's finished," Ezekiel murmured. "This man can do no more harm." Without a word, Glenn stalked forward. He knelt down, staring at the savior's agonized face, the way he still tried to speak through cracked lips. Glenn raised his knife, the blade reflecting the early sun. Then, something flickered in Glenn's expression, something almost like remorse. He drove the blade home with cold efficiency, ending the man's suffering. No hesitation, no ceremony, just a final, merciful cut. Ezekiel released a shaky breath. Even mercy, it seemed, came in brutal forms now. They regrouped at the outskirts, where Rosita was checking the vehicles. Carol stood apart from the others, cleaning her pistol. She glanced at Glenn, her eyes unreadable. "You all right?" she asked quietly. Glenn wiped the knife on his pant leg. "Fine." Carol's lips pressed into a thin line. She remembered a time when Glenn's voice had been lighter, when he teased Maggie about who would drive on supply runs. That warmth was as distant as a dream now. Suddenly, Daryl came around the corner, crossbow slung over his shoulder. He paused, seeing Glenn. Their eyes locked, unspoken tensions coiling between them like barbed wire. Without preamble, Daryl said, "We found a group of them holed up in a garage a ways east. They got kids." He spat the last word, anger and sadness mixing in his tone. Glenn's face was impassive. "They're saviors. Maybe. They wear the mark, but they're mostly kids. A couple teenagers with guns." For a second, it looked like Carol wanted to speak, but she didn't. Ezekiel and Rosita waited, too, each bracing for Glenn's decision. "We'll see it for ourselves," Glenn said finally. "Show me." They drove in silence, the only sound the rumble of the engine and the distant echoes of a world still crawling with the dead. Every mile seemed heavier than the last, weighed down by the knowledge of what they might have to do. When they arrived, the building was quiet, too quiet. Daryl led them around back, to a side door marked with chipped paint. Inside, the stench of mold and fear coiled in the dim corridors. They found the children in what might have once been an office. A handful of trembling faces peered up at them, flanked by two older boys clutching rifles. The older boys' eyes were wide with terror, knuckles white around the triggers. Glenn entered first, hands held slightly away from his body. "We're not here to hurt you," he said, his voice carefully controlled. One of the teenagers swallowed hard. Bullshit. We know who you are. Glenn glanced around the room, noting the meager supplies, the hungry looks. Then you know you can't win if you fight. Carol hovered in the doorway, watching the trembling rifle barrels. The kids were frightened, cornered animals. She'd seen that look before, in mirrors and nightmares. Ezekiel stepped forward, holding up empty palms. We can help you, he offered. We have food, shelter. You don't have to live like this. The teenagers exchanged a look, uncertainty flickering across their faces. Then one said, voice shaking, "We ain't going anywhere near you. We saw what happened at the sanctuary. You killed everybody." Glenn's gaze was steady. "Not everyone. Anyone who laid down arms, we spared. But if you raise a weapon against us, we don't hesitate." A soft sob broke from a girl crouched in the corner. She couldn't have been more than 10. Rosita's hand tightened into a fist at her side. For a moment, no one spoke. The tension in the stale air weighed on them all. Finally, Glenn slowly reached into his pack and withdrew a small tin of food, setting it gently on the floor. "I'm not asking you to trust us, but you need to decide if you want to die here or take a chance on living somewhere safer." The older boy eyed the tin warily, swallowing like it hurt. Carol broke the silence, her voice quiet. "Look at him. He's telling you the truth. If we wanted you dead, you'd already be gone." A pregnant pause lingered, thick with fear and indecision. Then, by some silent agreement, the two teenagers lowered their rifles. The weapons clattered against the floor, echoing in the stillness. The younger children let out shaky exhales. Glenn nodded once. It was a subtle gesture, but relief was nowhere on his face. Instead, he looked almost resigned, like everything was following a script he didn't quite believe in anymore. Outside, the sun was climbing higher, casting stark shadows on the broken pavement. They led the kids to the trucks, made space among the supplies. Ezekiel tried offering a comforting smile, but the children recoiled, eyes still clouded with fresh trauma. As they prepared to leave, Carol caught Glenn's sleeve. "This doesn't fix anything," she said softly. Not an accusation, but a statement. Glenn glanced over at the children, Daryl standing guard like a silent sentinel. "No," he said, "but it keeps them alive." They drove back toward Alexandria under a sky that felt too bright for all the darkness they carried. Rosita mumbled something about doing the right thing, but no one responded. The world had twisted their definitions of right and wrong into something unrecognizable. When they finally pulled through the gates, Tara came running, eyes widening at the sight of the children. Glenn stepped out, ignoring the curious looks from bystanders. The kids clung to each other like driftwood in a storm. Rick appeared, greeting them with a cautious nod. He glanced at Glenn, then at Carol, searching their expressions for answers. "Who are they?" he asked. Glenn didn't hesitate. "They're ours now." His voice carried an edge of finality, a tone that said there would be no discussion. Rick studied him, lips parting as if to argue, but then he merely closed his mouth. The lines on his face deepened, acceptance and unease swirling behind his eyes. The day rolled on, a tense hush settling over Alexandria. The children were taken to the infirmary for checkups, given blankets and space away from the chaos. Glenn wandered the perimeter, checking the walls, the gates, anything to keep himself occupied. Eventually, he wound up at Maggie's grave. Kneeling in the overgrown grass, he stared at the rough wooden cross marking where she lay. The memory of her last breath, her last smile, flickered behind his eyelids. He reached out, brushing dirt from the simple marker, his fingertips trembling. For a brief moment, the ruthless shell cracked. Grief poured into the air, raw and suffocating. No tears came, he'd shed them all long ago. At length he rose, swallowing the ache that threatened to swallow him. He glanced once over his shoulder, then left the graveyard behind. In his wake, he carried the weight of a choice he could never unmake, and the faintest spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, sparing a few children meant he hadn't fully lost himself in the flames. The world had already burned, but perhaps there were still seeds in the ash. And if there were, Glen Rhee would see to it they survived, even if he never felt sunlight in his soul again. No, he wouldn't look back. The ghosts still followed, and the road stretched on. But for the first time in a long time, Glen let himself wonder if a different future might be possible. One where every debt didn't have to be paid in blood.